Okay. Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero Show, where we code a complete game live on stream. This is a tough episode, basically. What I would like to say is we just finished last week doing some finishing up texture downloads, but we didn't actually get a chance to finish them up. And the reason for that is because there's still a fair bit of ambiguity about what the right way is to actually download textures. And this is sort of an ongoing saga, and honestly, to be completely honest with you, it's kind of what I would prefer to have happen on stream as well, because one of the big things about Handmade Hero is I kind of wanted to show how programming actually happens, as opposed to showing something after the fact, where you've already finished all the programming to say, here's what we ended up with. This is very typical, in my experience, with anything that involves any kind of graphics programming. You can go look at what the recommended ways are to do something, whatever NVIDIA's latest published thing is, or anything like that. But then when you actually go to implement it, you find out that that's totally not true, or that it doesn't work in some places, or that what they said was wrong, or not the right way anymore, and just nobody bothered to publish what the actual right way was, and blah, blah, blah. And so right now we're kind of in a little bit of limbo regarding texture downloads, and the reason for that is because although I did correspond a little bit with NVIDIA about it, I have not gotten a definitive answer back from them yet about what the actual proper way is to download textures overlapped on their card. Now, some people are of the impression, and I don't actually know if they're right or not, because none of them was particularly authoritative on this topic, and certainly no one had any actual data to show me. But some people were of the opinion that CPU, like they equated overlapping CPU work with overlapping GPU work. And we talked about this last week. Those aren't the same thing. There's two copies that have to happen in order for textures to get from the disk to the GPU. One of them, or two, I should say two required. You could have infinitely many more non-required copies, but there's two ones that are required. One is it has to go off of the disk, right, into memory that the GPU can see. And then one is it has to go from memory that GPU can see onto the actual resident memory of the GPU. So those two copies have to happen. Even if you use direct GPU mapping, which you can actually do. I should mention this, it's kind of an amusing thing. Like you can see it here. So there's even such things as direct GPU mapping, where, for example, you can have the you can have the GPU put something into system memory sort of directly, and then the network card can read it out of memory directly without necessarily having to go through any kind of intermediary. It doesn't have to be like moved around into two different mapped memories, if that makes sense. But even if you're doing something like that, obviously it has to come off the disk into system memory, and then from system memory into GPU. There's no such thing as GPU reading directly from the disk, as far as I know. And so you're always going to have at least those two copies. And so, yes, there's plenty of ways in OpenGL that we could, if we wanted to, get rid of that first copy. So when we load from disk into memory, right now, when we're calling GL text image 2D, it's copying it from our memory into memory that's visible to the GPU. So a range of memory on the host CPU that's visible to the GPU, so the GPU can transfer it. That is not the part that we were talking about, right? That is what everyone else seems to be talking about, but that is not the part we're actually talking about. The part we're talking about is, how do you tell the driver to start transferring that texture using the asynchronous using the asynchronous memory transfer capabilities that the card has. And so the way we did that was the last way I saw published on NVIDIA's website, since I figured that would be the most recent, which is that you have to create a secondary OpenGL context to do it. They don't currently have published, as far as I know, some other way of telling them, the driver, to do that asynchronous transfer. Now, until we hear back from NVIDIA, we're never going to know, right? I just don't know. because they're the only ones who know. We could try to do a bunch of experiments about it if we wanted to, but we may not even really have any knowledge of what things to even experiment with, because we don't know how their driver works internally. We don't have the source code to it, and so we can't even really predict what sorts of activities we could do that would convince the driver to do exactly that. It may be a very simple thing that we can do. It may be a very complicated thing, but we have no idea. So that is where the texture transfer stuff stands at the moment. And so I think what we should do, at least temporarily, is to wait to see if NVIDIA gets back to us and gives us some better information about what they think the best way for us to transfer them would be. And then when we get that information, we can go back and modify how we're doing it to conform to that. Because it certainly seems like the way they suggested to do it before is not actually the way that you would think. Now, that said, there is one piece of the transfer that we don't do in Handmade Hero that was recommended by them in their original thing, and that was to fence the download on either side. And the reason that we didn't fence the download on either side was simply because we don't actually care if the download gets fenced. But maybe we'll find out when they write us back, hopefully they'll write us back, maybe we'll find out that if you don't put the fence in, the driver doesn't realize that it needs to do the operation or something. I'm not sure. So I really don't know. I think I would rather just take a wait and see approach. I don't really want to try mucking around with it because I feel like it's not a super constructive use of our time to try and play with that any further. Especially because if we really wanted to, we could always just continue to download the textures on a single thread, and that's not really the end of the world. It's not going to kill us to do that. It's only the GPU overlap part that we were trying to make sure was set up properly. And so if it turns out we don't get that, we don't get that. We can certainly go do some stuff with our buffer objects or pixel buffers or whatever to eliminate the first copy if we felt we want to do that. That seems pretty straightforward. So we still have other options for optimizing texture downloads if we find that we need to do that. So yeah, so I would like to know, I hope they will sort of get back to us and tell us what the preferred method is for that so we can make sure the code is architected properly so that when we want to optimize our texture downloads and make sure they're very fast sometime in the future, we are in a good place to do that. Until then, I say just leave it. All right, so where does that leave us? Well, I believe I was taking a look at the to-do file. I think I may have forgotten to save it. That may have been a slight mistake on my part, but we didn't really do too much to it, so it's not really that big of a deal. Anyway, let's take a look at that. Oops, I made a proj. Let's take a look at that to-do. Here it is, just so we can kind of see what the story is. So it looks like I did save it, actually. So I think we're all good. So this is where we were at. And we have a couple different things that we can do. Like I said, we can sort of push forward on the rendering stuff. We can fix the debug code. And then we've got sort of some audio debugging that we could choose to do as well. But like I was saying on last week's stream, as I was kind of dithering about it, I'm like, I don't know what the most interesting thing to do next is. It's hard to say. It might be to kind of wrangle our debug code into shape. It might be to go finish the rendering stuff. I think what I'd like to do is go finish the debug code because it's kind of nasty in there. And it'd be nice to just kind of go through and spend some time cleaning it out and getting it so that it's running the features that we actually care about relatively reliably. And that would be like a profile that we can use reliably and some maybe some control over like variables and things like that, like in terms of being able to dump data in a sort of coherent way. Because right now we don't have a lot of ways of inspecting stuff or diagramming stuff, and we would like to be able to do a little bit more of that. All right. So let's take a little bit of a look at what we've got there. I'll just jump back over into it. Well, I guess I might compile first. There we go. And on this machine, since this is an AMD machine, the problems that I was just talking about with the texture downloads don't actually seem to have, they don't happen, right? So it's kind of, you'll just have to take my word for it that people were reporting problems with that, and you know it doesn't happen on this machine. So you can't actually see the problem, but it was there. And they also were, the folks who were able to repro the problem said that if they did a GL flush after to force the texture download to happen on the separate thread, that was another way they could make that happen. So they did something like this, if that makes sense, which we could leave in there for now since we don't really care until NVIDIA tells us the secret answers. We don't really care what that code looks like for now. We're just waiting anyway. So we could leave that on there if that helps people who are running on NVIDIA cards use this without having to worry too much. So there's that. All right. Where we were at before with the debug code is we kind of did a bunch of work to see how far we could get on having things be easily recordable and easily usable, but we never quite got to the point where everything was copacetic, right? And that may have been because we tried to do a little too much with it. You know, we experimented with a bunch of stuff, and sometimes you may get to the point, which arguably the debug code may have gotten to, where you're just like, if we want to finish this in a reasonable amount of time, we may want to pare it down from what it can do to what we actually only specifically need, just in the interest of not having it be a huge project. If you decide that debug code is the most important thing and you want to go ahead and just spend a ton of time making a great debug system, that's certainly a good idea. And if it's a reusable debug system that you can use on a lot of different projects, that could be a very good idea. But we may want to sort of like say, all right, we're not going to do maybe, we might not go as far as we possibly can with everything. We may keep it a little bit, more streamlined than that potentially. All right. So the first thing I'd like to do is I want to take a look at the debug interface stuff because that's sort of where we left things. And what I'd like to do is, since we kind of want to think of this as like a finishing pass for the debug stuff, I think what I want to do is sort of come at it from a few different places where we go, here's what we want to be able to do. Let's make sure there's a good way for us to do it, right? And so, for example, we had a case, and let's just try to work on just that one case and get it in, and so that we can sort of like make sure it's integrated in there and finished. We had an example case where, like here, there's some functions like global pause and global use software rendering. And although we have live code editing for everything in the game, the platform layer is the one thing that we don't have any live code editing on, right? So right now, we don't actually have any way of actually, of ever doing that. We don't have any way of toggling that variable at runtime, because although normally we could just go ahead and toggle it using some kind of live code editing trick, which we have, we can't actually do that here. So one thing that I would like to be able to do is make something like this easy to edit, so that it would be easy for us to say this variable is a variable that I want to edit, right? This variable is a variable that I want to be able to, I want to see a little interface of it up here, right? So, man, our startup time is awful now that we launch OpenGL. That AMD context creation is super expensive. So yeah, so here is our, am I wrong about that? Like, look at that. Look at how long that takes. Look at how long that takes. That's all OpenGL initialization right there. It's just brutal. I almost want to run in software just to not have to deal with that, right? But anyway, so that's an example that, and even this show cursor would be an interesting one, but global use software rendering and global pause are some examples of things that I would like to have a way of controlling in a nice interface potentially, right? I would like that to be something we could do. So let's think about how we might want to have that happen. Now, the best possible way, if we were in a sort of a meta-programming kind of a mood, would be if we just marked it right here, right? And we could do that in a completely zero-cost way. We'd just do something like, meta-program, whatever you want to do here is like editable variable. You could imagine, you could make up anything you wanted, and if there was the pre-pass that went through here, it could sort of grab that and then do something with it. But I feel like we want to keep things relatively simple for this. If we're trying to sort of finish off the debug system, we don't want to introduce too much extraneous stuff. So the next best thing I think would be to just have in the code somewhere a place where we announce these variables as things that we want to edit, and we just put them in there when we want them, right? And so to do that, I would take these two that I actually want, which is global pause and global use software rendering, and I'll just put them down somewhere where they would actually be relevant, right? So, you know, inside our loop here, where we are doing our while running, right here, what I could do is while we're doing our global running, oops, that's not actually, that's a test loop. We're actually looking at this one. While we're doing this, this global running bit here, then what I might want to do is say, oh, okay, let's announce these variables. Maybe I want to keep that inside that block. Well, it's not really executable refresh, so I'll put it up here. So what I want to do here, right, is I want to be able to announce these variables, and we sort of had a way that we were going to do that in the Handmade debug interface code. That was debug var, right? So we had this sort of method where we could sort of say debug variable, and when we said debug variable, we could say type, path, and variable. And I can't actually scroll this up into view, can I? I don't think 4Coder has a way to do that. Well, I could do this. There we go. So debug variable is a way of saying we have a variable, we want it to be editable, right? And it looks like that basically defines that variable in a particular location, right? There's the variable type that it is, and it's doing this sort of global constants thing. So all of the stuff has to be, it has to be kind of out in those global constants. Now, I don't know if that's such a good idea. That was how we were doing it, but I don't actually know if we want it to work that way, right? So like I said, this may have been a case where we just went a little bit too far, and I feel like what we probably want is something a little bit more straightforward, like something where we can just say, like, you know, maybe like this is debug editable or something like this. Something where we can just say, all right, we'll announce when things are debug editable, and maybe we give up some of the stuff we were trying to go for in the other cases, but you know, something where we can just say, I want to be able to debug edit these things. Now, I like the path part of things. I liked the fact that we could have a path, and because the reason that I liked that path part of things was because I like having a way of categorizing these things in the interface so that the interface doesn't get too clogged, right? Because, you know, if you have like 100 debug variables in there, if you don't have some way of keeping that under control, it can be a little bit janky to get to, right? It can be a little bit onerous, right? So in this case, I guess what I'll say is like, okay, when we come through here, we'll say debug edit, and here's this thing, and I'll just say where I want that to be placed in the path as a string, like kind of like we were doing before. And so where do we want the global pause to be? Maybe we want that to be in like, you know, platform. I don't know if we really need the leading slash. Do we need a leading slash? I don't know, probably not. Maybe we want that to be inside platform, like, you know, paused or something like that. And this will be in platform software rendering, something like this, maybe? I'm not sure. So, you know, that would be sort of analogous to what we were doing before, but maybe just a little bit saner. And we're not trying to do anything particularly fancy. We're just saying edit a global variable. And that's really the feature that it would have, right? So in this case, like where we've got the debug if and that sort of stuff, we could also, you know, this just allows us to simplify this down to the point where those variables are still defined in our code. And the only alternative to that, again, without any metaprogramming context there, is that we would have to do sort of the way we were doing it before, where there's a config, right? And this config file has all the stuff in it. Now, I just don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense, and the reason that I think that that's a little bit trickier is just because it just, as we were going down that path, it just doesn't feel that good to have this giant file with all of these things named in this particular way, you know? it just seems a little overwrought. And maybe, maybe I'm missing it. Maybe this is actually a good way to do it. I don't really know. But it just seems like it's a little bit, it just seems a little bit off is all. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm doing a stupid thing by getting rid of it. Maybe we should try to continue to use it that way. I mean, one nice thing about this, right, is that it does, I guess, allow you to sort of more easily sort of grab whole sets of settings, right, if they're all in kind of one file like that. I suppose that's something worth looking at, maybe. I don't know. I wish I had a stronger opinion about it. I just feel like going through that loop of having the config file seemed to be causing us kind of some problems where when we would add one to the code, we would have to go in and add it to the config. Maybe that's not such a bad idea though either. I mean, you could imagine at the end of the day going back and doing that. I don't know. I can't say that I have a strong opinion either way. I think just what I would like to do is make it so that it's maybe just not so... I'd like to make it not so complicated. So I'm just going to try and take a little bit of that complexity out of it, is all. So I think I'd like to try that. And all this is saying is that, hey, there's a variable here. It's called global pause. I want to kind of bind it to this editing point in the debug system. And it's assumed that I am going to take care of that. I've defined the bool. So it's the onus is on me, and we'll just keep it that way. It's not as perhaps efficacious as the other way where the debug system is thinking about it a little bit more, but maybe that's the way that that's going to go. And so in here, when we've got these, when I and I think debug value was debug value the way we were specifying that? Maybe not debug variable. Was debug value the way we were doing that before? Because I think we kind of had this concept where it was a thing that was getting. Yeah, I think debug value is it. So we can probably even say that maybe this is, a way that could work. Maybe we can sort of say, let's take a look at debug value as potentially a way to do that. And maybe we can even sort of piggyback on this and just get rid of that concept of the debug variables entirely. So let me take a look and see. Let me see how we were doing that. I think we were doing it this way, right? We would just say, hey, here's a begin data block, here's an end data block. And the begin and data block, I guess the way that we did that, let me see here. Debug begin block. Yeah, name and ID. I don't really know how the ID differed there. I think it was just to give it a GUID that it could always use to remember. I'm going to take a look at where we were using that before, which was in the place where we printed out the entities, if you remember correctly. So we had a begin data block, I believe. Begin, there it is. And yeah, I think it's just like that's just some ID that's sort of associated with it. I don't know if we required that or not. But we'll see. So this was, let's just say this is platform, and this debug ID, I don't know if we actually have one or not. Let's call it 0 for now. We'll see if that's a problem. Right end of int, there is no step-to conversion. Is trying to match the debug ID, comma int. Debug operator equals, so that debug ID, I guess has to be, man, it's been a long time since we touched this code. That debug ID actually has to be a real thing. Yeah. There it is. You can kind of see it here. So if we want to make this one of these, it's pretty trivial to make a debug ID. And that debug ID would just be like something that we could point to, some kind of stable pointer in the system, which is not particularly tricky, right? Since we could just use anything, we could use, any pointer from here that's going to be unique would be sufficient to make a unique ID for it. So let's just see what happens there. This turnaround time is awful. My lord. So yeah. So in this case, unhandled end data block. What are you talking about? Is this not the correct way to do this? Did I do something wrong? Handmade world mode. P. It has a begin data block and an end data block, which is the correct way to do it, right? So that would be the way we would capture that, right? I don't think there's anything particularly odd there. Seems like that should have worked. I wonder if that's just an artifact of the fact that we didn't quite finish the debug code stuff. I'm going to take a look at what happens in here. I feel like we don't, like the debug stuff doesn't print out in this mode, right? I don't actually see the debug there. So it's here if we're back in here, but if we actually go into the game, we don't get the debug output anymore, which is lame. So that's something we have to debug as well. Because you can kind of see, I guess unless the trees are on top of it somehow, because we wouldn't really see much against the white, right? This is just white text. So if it was back there, we wouldn't actually see it. But presumably it's on top of everything. So the fact that we don't see it there is kind of odd. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but before we stopped working on the debug stuff, we moved it into its own sort of place in the platform loop, right? I mean, here it is, if I'm not mistaken. Right here. So debug frame end, that should, in theory, have added the debug calls right there. So my thought is, I wonder if this means that we are sorting, like that those, basically the sort values of those strings are not sufficient to put them on top somehow. But I wouldn't even think that that would be possible either. So I want to take a look and see why we're not getting those. Because I don't really understand why. I'm going to actually, I think what I would do, I think what I'd like to do is first of all see whether they're being drawn. And the way that I think that I can do that relatively effectively is just make it so that the game world mode doesn't actually render. It never gets a chance to actually render itself. I think that's probably the easiest thing to do. So like in update and render world, update and render world takes as an input the render group. And if I was to just if0 this out, and so that it doesn't have any way to actually render anything, it's not going to do anything. Let me go back up here. Doot, doot. There we go. Let me see what result is actually meant to do in this case. Not a particularly good name. So result always returns false. That's pretty funny. All right. So it looks like that's just completely useless. So what I'd like to do is prevent it from rendering. So now when we switch into that mode, there won't be anything else in the way. So I can just see whether this is still drawn or not, right? That's all I really want to see. And it looks like it actually still is. I should probably include a clear so we can be a little more, like I could just move the if0 down just a bit. So now it is actually still clearing the screen. And that way I can see if it's still drawing, because that'll tell me if it's a sorting problem or not, which is what I need to know. Okay, so as I suspected, it's just that this stuff is getting sorted in such a way that it's below what's in the actual game world. So I need a way of making it so that those things sort in front and cannot be put behind stuff that's actually in the game, because I never want that to actually be the, to actually occur. So the question is how to do that most effectively. The sort key that I give to fonts, or that I give to elements, right? I actually have a fair bit of control over what that sort key is because we just make it up. And so what I could do is make it so that when we do like a debug text line, when we actually do any kind of text out, so, you know, I guess in this case, I've got, let's see here, debug text op. Is that the only place we actually do that? Let me see where I actually do a push bitmaps. Push bitmap. Yeah. So I do one here, and I do one there. So this is the only place we ever draw fonts in this whole system, right? So if I have this push bitmap thing here, when I'm sending this down, I could have some way for push bitmap to sort of override what that z value was in a way that only changes its sort order. You know what I'm saying? So for example, in the Handmade render group, .h, well, actually, I guess in this case it'd be .cpp. In the push bitmap routine, you can kind of see here that it's going to go through push render element to, you know, to do whatever it's got to do, and it's going to call this dim basis sort key, or it's not going to call, it's going to use the result of that get bitmap dim call. It's going to use the result that it put in the sort key in order to determine how to sort. But we're free to pass anything else we want here, right? So we could trivially just do some completely other thing we could completely bias the source in any way the sort in any way we want by just adding some kind of like a sort bias here, right? We could add something in here that's just like, oh, is there a sort bias? You know, whatever it is. By default, there's nothing, but if you want to, you can bias the sort value in any way that you want. And that would be pretty trivial. Now, I don't remember, is our sort key, I guess our sort key is at the moment floating point. So it would be an R32 there. So that's one way to do it. And if we did it that way, then when we do our push bitmap here, I don't super know what we're still using the C-align value for. But I believe it's just for sort of vestigial remain at this point. In get render entity basis p, it's the thing that multiplies the alignment value, right? So, oh, no, it's not in there. So I guess it's only in get bitmap dim. So there's the C-align right there. So essentially, that's if we don't want to use the alignment information, then we use that value, right, to adjust it. And I don't really know who's actually still using that. We can check pretty easily by actually just doing this if we want to. And now it'll give us an error. Oops. It'll give us an error everywhere in the code where anyone's calling that version of the function. And so we can go ahead and step through that. So let's see where that actually is. Oh, duh. Forgot there's two versions of this. Although it looks like that means this version definitely never has that happen. Right? So everyone is calling through this actual one, which makes sense because they're only going to call through the bitmap ID version. So I really didn't need to test that one at all. That was just kind of a waste of everyone's time and energy. What I meant to do, or should have done, I should say, is this. All right. So if I come in here and look for that, it seems like there's really only one place, and it's here. And so this is, literally it's just for the debug system. The debug system displaying a bitmap on the screen so that it can do it without, so it can basically do a debug display of the bitmap is the only case where we ever used that. Kind of means we probably shouldn't be passing that, and that should be a more special purpose thing, but yeah. So that's something to be aware of. That is something to be aware of, to be sure. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to render group, let's see, group.cpp. So in here, if I then want to, I'll reinstate that, obviously, for the time being. And what I'd like to do here is take that sort bias and actually make that be a real thing for the moment. So there's our sort bias. And so now someone can pass the sort bias in. When we call push bitmap, we'll pass the sort bias. And when we do that sort bias, it will affect how the sorting progresses. So now inside the debug system, if we want to make everything always be on top in terms of our fonts, then in our push bitmap call, what we could do is at the end here, we would just pass some kind of a sort bias. Now we want it to be closer to us, and z comes at us, I believe, in our coordinate system. So we want this to just be some relatively large number here, right? We want this to be something big. Now I don't know, I guess technically we could just set it to the maximum, but I don't know that that's actually necessary in this case. But we could say it's the maximum value. I hope that doesn't break anything. I have to think about if there's anything floating point wise that would break. But I assume that it would just clamp out the value. So there we go. Now we've gotten our debug values back, and that's all good. Of course, you can also see that we can't really see them very well, right? They don't really show up particularly well. And the reason for that, of course, is that if the background, like in this case, happens to be bright white, the text is bright white, we can't see them. We may want for our debug code to do something where we actually sort of draw a little bit of additional drop shadowing onto them so that we can see them even in circumstances where they might be harder to see. And there's a number of different ways we can do that. One way would be to just have the push bitmap call happen twice, right? Like you can imagine doing this in this 2 different times, if that makes sense. Where the bitmap offset here, we could just go ahead and make that be offset by just a little bit. I believe we're in pixel space here. So something like this, I guess we'd want to be down in Y, so it really look like that. And then when we do the color, we would just have it be black. And so we could do something like this, which I think I put those in the wrong order, of course. So that's my bad. But now you can see we can at least read them in sort of all circumstances. It's not the world's prettiest debug display, certainly, but it at least allows us to see, even against really unfortunate, kind of backdrops. It lets us kind of see what the text says. We could do better, but that's probably good enough for now. Now, since we have the ability to sort, I suppose this is the case where now we would probably want to say, let's not do float max. In this case, we'd say, oh, we want that one to be on top, so we'll have 2 of these, and we'll just make this one sort higher. Because now we can just play with the sort key however we want. So we know we always want the white leading text on top, and the black backdrop we want underneath. So we can guarantee that always happens in the renderer by just setting the sort keys in the corresponding way, if that makes sense. So, all right, that's all fine. That's great, but we still have to get back to sort of what we were originally doing, which is we want some way here to start to edit these values. And like I said, I don't really know what the deal is with these edit blocks. I also don't really know how this stuff, if this stuff was still working where we selected. So I think it is. So there it is. So all right, so I didn't do anything wrong. This is the part that I wanted to test. You can see that end data block just doesn't have a printout thing for it. That was probably just a thing we did that was stupid when we were putting this stuff in there. And so I didn't do anything wrong with my begin and end in this other case, right? So that seems fine. And all this stuff still does seem to be working okay. So I think we're actually in relatively good shape. So what I probably want to do now is I just want to make it so that these values can be edited. And then I think we'd be okay. Now what I don't really know is I don't understand how we ended up in exactly this situation here with the readout, because I feel like this should sort of be underneath something a little bit more specifically. So I feel like the indentation didn't work properly. So let's just go take a look at that really quickly as well before we start in on anything there. just to try and figure out what was going on with that. All right, so here's our debug begin and our debug end. And in this case, I guess the platform bit, I'm not sure how this was meant to work. So I'm going to go ahead and again look at the world mode code there and just see what it was doing when it did the debug values. And I guess it's just like simulation underscore entity, that's sort of the block name. So this would be like, I don't know, platform controls? I don't know what it would be. And then I guess the idea is maybe we hadn't done printing out of the actual block names yet. I'm not sure. That could make sense. And yeah, that appears to be exactly what it was. So it looks like the way that we're printing out blocks is really just kind of haphazard and stupid. So maybe that part is, kind of unfinished code in there that we have to go in and take a look at. Let me jump back into the game here so we can get the simulation one again as well. Yeah, and you can see that's what it's doing. It's basically saying, here's the block, it's simulation entity, and then it gets to the end and it's got this unhandled thing it doesn't know what to do with. So I think what we probably want to do, the end data block one. So I think what we probably want to do here is we probably want to just start going in there and cleaning up this code, because it looks like if we clean up this code and just make this a little bit nicer, then we can just use that for everything, and we don't have to worry about the other code with the, the if controls. I think we can just get rid of that code, and just that would be a nice way to pare things down. So basically, like let's see here, this debug interface code. Where is it? This like the debug if and the debug variable code. I think I'm just gonna say like we're just not gonna do this anymore. That was like, it was an experiment. I think it's just adds too much complexity, and we should try to focus on minimizing that complexity down a little bit, because we already have, we know we want the ability to sort of do those little data dumps. Let's just put everything through that and make sure that works okay, and not try to have another system that maintains the H file and all that stuff. I think that's just too much, right? So let's get rid of those. Let's just cut those out entirely and see how we would replace them if they just simply weren't there, right? So basically these exist in the code as you see in them here, and I want to make them go away. All right. So essentially what this means is just that we have to do a little bit of work to pull these out into globals ourselves, right? And this is why I say it's not the ultimate be-all and end-all of the thing that you might want. But again, this is just me making that decision that I want to try and keep the complexity of the debug system down a little bit more. I didn't like quite how far it had gotten in terms of how much time we probably want to spend on the total. So I think it's just a good time to kind of pare it down a little bit. So what we need if we want these to continue happening is we just need to have these be variables that are accessible somewhere, global variables that can be sort of accessed, right? They can be announced and they can be accessed. And so I think probably the easiest way to do that, again, would be to just take the ones that we have now and put those into some centralized location where we just announce them, and that'll be sufficient. I think that's fine for our purposes. All right, so let's take a look at where that would actually go. I feel like probably if those just lived kind of in like handmade.h or something, that would probably be reasonable. You can see we sort of started to have a little bit something like that here. So maybe I'll just go ahead and take handmade config and just drop these guys. I guess we could even just leave them in handmade config. Now that I think about it, we could literally just do this, right? We could just do this and say, well, these are all Booleans now, right? They're global variables. I probably should have added that while I was thinking of it, but I didn't. No big deal. we go. And you know, they can all be set to the variables they actually were set to originally. So I don't know that we need this to be quite so verbose, right? Because the reason that we named them that way was because we needed for the path to be sort of baked in there. And so these don't actually need to be as verbose as they are, certainly. You know, the other thing that I need to do, obviously, here is I need to remove the code we had that does the writing to handmade config, because we also don't want to overwrite that anymore, potentially. So I need to make sure that that's not happening. And it looks like we got rid of that, so that's fine. I just want to make sure we weren't going to do that and ruin our lives. So let's take a look here. So where is handmade config actually being used? Let me see here. I guess it must be in handmade.h at the very top. Maybe it's in handmade platform. So there's handmade config. It's at the very, very top. And so it's before we even define any of these other, like even our types. And that's not probably good, right? I mean, we want to be able to use our types. So I feel like this kind of wants to be definitely down a little bit more. And I feel like it also probably wants to be inside handmade.cpp now. Or rather handmade.h. I don't think we want it to be part of the platform stuff, because the platform can do its own, and we don't really need to do that, right? So let's see. That's supposed to be an R32. And that's supposed to have an equal sign. So I think now we should be in good shape. And now instead of like this debug if stuff, it would just be if, right? And we don't really need this anymore, because those can be, you know, we can put those when we announce all of them, that will happen automatically. So let's see. That's an undeclared identifier. How is an undeclared identifier? Is handmade.h somehow not? Wouldn't handmade config have it in there? Ah, it's the global constants part. So I guess I probably want to leave that in there. So I think for now, I guess until I want to actually maybe do something more extensive. Excuse me. I probably want to at least leave the word global in there. That would be my preference. So I think I'm going to go ahead and just do global constants, place of global. There we go. Okay. And I could even, you know, I'm just going to leave it with global. All right, so let's start with that. So this is global render camera debug distance for now. This is another if, global constants. What are you complaining about? I don't even know what that was complaining about. We'll check in a second. There we go. Yeah, so this is just a rote modification. Let's go ahead and, I don't know why the compiler is so confused about that if. I guess because it doesn't know how to interpret debug if, I suppose. I can understand that. There we go. Let's see. What else we got? So this is entirely rote, nothing interesting happening here whatsoever. And there we go. So that didn't seem to like show lighting samples. Why not? Global renderer show lighting samples. So for some reason, the handmade render.cpp handmade render.cpp for whatever reason does not seem to actually have that included. That could be because it's in the platform layer, because I believe we moved it in there after we sort of had to do the two-tier, the two top-tier system. So let me take a quick look at that. Yeah. So these guys don't have that config file present. And that's actually fine, because like I said, I'm just going to put these in various places. I might eventually get rid of handmadeconfig.h altogether and just put these things in the files to which they belong. But for now, I can just move that out and say, okay, well, show lighting samples is just going to be something that has to do with this particular file and isn't something that ever actually gets looked at any other way, right? So here's global render use software. This one now is, I believe, something that we want entirely in the platform layer as well. So that's this one, and I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to put that into the Win32 handmade part exactly like it was before. So in the Win32 handmade part, we've got the global variables. So now we've got render use software and use software rendering, not really the way you would want to name things. So I think we should go ahead and take care of that as well. So really what we're talking about here is two different things. Win32 display buffer in window, this is whether or not we're using OpenGL at all. You can sort of see this. So what this is actually, it's not render or use software. This is global, like, display with OpenGL. Or I guess I should say, this is whether we're using software rendering, regardless of whether we're using hardware to display it or not. I think that's what I was actually trying to say. Yeah. So this should be global render, like render game via, or render. I don't really know how to differentiate between the two. One is like, do you display using OpenGL, and one is do you render using OpenGL. So I guess it's like, let me flip these cases and we'll just say render, if render everything, I don't know. I'm having trouble coming up with the name this is, because it's not use software rendering. I guess there's use software rendering and use GDI to display, and they're really two. They're really not. All the permutations don't actually exist there. You can't have global use software rendering be true or false, and global use GDI to display also be true and false. So really, it's more like enum, renderer or rendering type, and there's really a couple different ones. There's Win32 render type software and GDI. There's Win32 render type software and OpenGL. And there's Win32 render type OpenGL. Right? And another way to say this would be like soft render or render render software display GDI. There's render software display OpenGL, and then there's render OpenGL display OpenGL. That's really the only cases that we support. We don't support the fourth case, which is render OpenGL and display with GDI. That's not a thing we actually support. nor do I imagine we would ever want to. And I'm going to sort these such that by default, 0 is the one we would normally do, right? So in this case, we've got Win32 rendering type, and I've got sort of a global variable here of that type. And that, I think, makes a little more sense to me. So now we get rid of this, and now it's clear what's going on, and it's not confusing. So now I can say, all right, if we are doing rendering with OpenGL and displaying with OpenGL, then that's one case. So that is our global rendering type equals that, right? And that is actually the bottom case. So that's the first case that we would have, and that's the case where everything is just going through OpenGL and there's no interaction with GDI whatsoever. I mean, what we call swap buffers. So that's everything going through OpenGL. Then if we're not doing that path, then we need to switch here and say which one of these do we want to do, right? So if we have global rendering type, we want that to be render software display GDI. Then we go down one path. I guess it's actually the way this happens to be set up actually looks more like this. And so this one is, right? This one is render in software and display with OpenGL. And there it is. And then finally, we have the last one, which is render in software and display with GDI. And so here I can also do an assertion where I'm like, hey, by the way, in this case, it had better equal the one remaining type that we know we have, because otherwise there's some kind of bug where the value of global rendering type got set to something bad. So, and like again, the reason that I ordered them this way was just because I want the 0 value to be the default value, because that way it's just like automatically I always like things that initialize to 0. That's always the best. If you can have everything initialized by just clearing the buffer, that's always my favorite, because it's the least fussing. So I always try to make always the default value to be 0 wherever possible. So anyway, that's pretty much it for that. Let's go ahead and compile this. There we go. And now when we're announcing it, we have to, it's going to bring up a kind of an interesting point that we'll get to probably tomorrow. But when we're actually announcing it, I need to put the global rendering type in here, global rendering type. And that is that it won't display in a way that's particularly useful to us, right? It'll display it as an actual number value, as opposed to one of those symbolic constants. And there's ways that we can get around that, which we could look at as well. So anyway, this is what I think we actually want to do. And so I think we're about out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the Q&A here. And what we'll do is tomorrow we will hook these up for editing and maybe clean up some of these things. And then that gets us a little closer to being in a place where these are good. All right. So yeah, I think that's good. I think getting rid of those is just, like I said, it just gets rid of a little complexity. And I think that's a good, that's just a good thing to do, because we want to kind of focus in on now making the debug system like sort of usable and defining exactly what it does, and then not going any further. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the Q&A. So if anyone has questions about what we did, please preface it with Q:, so I can see it, and I will answer it. Well, we can certainly end the stream pretty quickly if it turns out there are no Q:. Oh, no way, Cuber Caleb, you got accepted to college. Congratulations. That's excellent news. I'm really glad to hear that. For those of you who don't know, Cuber Caleb is a very regular viewer on Handmade Hero. He is here all the time. Dino 27, 1988. Casey, at what point is it bad to separate everything into multiple files, and when is it good? Well, I mean, I've sort of answered this question before, but I can answer it again. It's not really very complicated. Mostly the answer is that files are there. Let me take this in two parts. Assuming that you have control over the project, files are there for your organizational benefit. So the answer as to when it is good or bad to split something into multiple files is entirely based on your brain. If you find that having everything in one file versus having things in multiple files is better for you, and you just had one gigantic file, that would be fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. So to a certain extent, the answer is largely dependent on what you find most efficient for editing. Like, I like to have an H file and a CPP file, as you can see, for general regions of my code, so that I can look at them side by side in the editor. And it just so happens that the editors that I use, like Emacs, are much better at doing that than in trying to keep multiple views into the same buffer. And so that's just the way I got used to separating my code. Now, if I had used an editor that wasn't like that, or that maybe had better support for like browse info kinds of stuff, maybe I wouldn't divide my files that way, right? And so the way you divide files is almost universally, it's the case that you want to divide it the way that helps you program most effectively. Now, that said, in a circumstance where you're not programming like we're programming a Handmade Hero, like in Handmade Hero we have one translation unit essentially for the entire game, so everything just gets slammed into one translation unit and off it goes. The compile times are super fast, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you're on a project that is not that way, and it's one of these nightmare things like, oh, I don't know, it's like maybe the Unreal Engine these days where it's like 8,000 files and it takes 7 years to run a compile, right? At that point, you may have a real hard technical reason for splitting something up into multiple files, and the reason is because anytime you change a file, it and all of its dependencies have to be recompiled. And if that costs a lot, then you have to think about those costs when making decisions about how to split things into files. So if I was programming in an environment where I had to worry about that, I might make very different decisions about how my things are split into files, because now there's a real reason to and not to split or not split things into files, right? And when I'm working with a code base like that, I have to be aware of that. So you kind of have to be aware about the build process of the project that you're working on. And that may have constraints on how you separate things into files, such that what I said in the first part, which is you should organize files the way that makes it most easy for you to keep in your head and work with, you may not have the luxury of doing that, depending on the circumstances, as you sort of move into certain projects that don't have a reasonable compile time, that don't have a reasonable build process. Similarly, if you are working on a team with lock-based source code control, so some source code control systems, right, like Git or CVS, SVN, like the sort of the traditional Unix-style source code controls, are lockless. I mean, sometimes they have optional locking, but for the most part, all the edits are lockless, which means that when you are editing your code, you can edit whatever you want, and then the time that you deal with making changes that overlap with someone else's changes is when you go to like check, to merge those things together. But other source code control systems like Perforce, for example, by default operate in a locked mode, which means that you actually say that you're going to edit a file. And you're like, I'm going to edit this file now. And no one else can edit that file while you're editing the file. And so if you're in a lock-based setting like that, again, I would don't use a source code control system like that. It's really bad if you are on teams. So you really don't want that. At RAD, it was fine to use Perforce because it's usually one person, one project. And so Perforce, and of course, this is sort of a separate story. When we were trying to find a source code control utility to use, there were very few. There's a lot more of them available now than there were today. There were a lot more available today than there were then, so we didn't have much of a choice. Perforce was like the only reasonable source code control you could use. It was like either that or CVS, and all the other options were these awful things. Nowadays, you don't have to worry about that. You wouldn't pick Perforce, you'd use something else. But you could use SVN, for example. So anyway, that's a whole other story. But point being, I would never use a lock one today if you could avoid it, unless it's only you using it, in which case it doesn't matter so much. But if you should find yourself in that situation and it's beyond your control because you're just on a team and they'd use that, right? You get a job somewhere and you have to do it. You don't have the option of saying, hey guys, it's stupid to use the locking source code control system. How about everyone just change that right now? That's not going to happen, right? And so at that point, you kind of have to be of the understanding, well, whatever the size of the files are that I choose and how I choose to break them up, that's the granularity of the locking now. And so again, you have this external imposition on file, kind of file setups, having something that has nothing to do with what you might want to do, and it's more about what the tools are forcing you to do, right? So yeah. That's what I would say. Geno 27, 1988. Okay, so basically personal preference, compile time, and external positions. Thank you very much for your answer. No problem. Rohit N. Does texture download on the stream mean GL text image 2D? Well, not really. I guess what I would say is, so at the moment, we wanted the texture download code to be relatively correct structurally, right? So we haven't done anything too aggressive there, but we did make it so that the asset background threads can call GL text image 2D on them to submit the textures to the graphics card. That is happening. But we found that that was unreliable on NVIDIA, so we are waiting for them to tell us what they think the best way for us to do that would be. Should we never try to call on a separate thread? Because it was their materials originally that made me think they would prefer us to do that, if that makes sense. So on the stream right now, texture download, I think has been said to just refer to the fact that getting the texture down to the card, anything involved in that. And right now, the only thing we really have to do for that is GL text image 2D, because at the moment, we're not trying to do any other kind of optimization of that path. In the future, the process of getting the texture down to the card might involve other steps, like writing into graphics card memory directly off the load, for example. Hopefully that answers the question. So the phrase texture download is just kind of nebulous at this point. It doesn't mean anything particular. It just means getting the texture data down to the graphics card so it can use it. People often call that texture upload as well. We talked about this on the stream. Probably the better way for me to have said it the whole time if I was trying to think very specifically about the best nomenclature, would actually just be to call it a texture transfer. But because whether it's a download or an upload, it's like, depends on whose perspective. Are you talking about the GPU? Are you talking about the CPU? Whose side is the what, right? So it's a texture transfer is really what it is. Dude in basement, have you ever used Pragma's section and grouped memory into sections and read the map file? Or have you always used this style of metaprogramming? Yeah, I've never done that, no. I usually use two-pass metaprogramming. I don't ever try to do back-read metaprogramming. Huber Caleb, off topic, if you want to extend the hot code reloading to work with structure changes, wouldn't you have to store metadata about each struct along with the information in every allocation so that you could walk the data, adjust the data, and move around in fixed pointers? Yes, but it is easier than that makes it sound. Sort of. That's one thing. And the other thing that I would say is I think we talked about this on the stream because I believe Elvin had a question about that, and I kind of walked through how that process works. So on the stream somewhere is me talking about that, but I'm afraid I don't know exactly where. But yes, you basically just have to have what is essentially the same as the struct that C, the information C stores for a struct to know how it's laid out. You are keeping that same thing. But that's not that hard because, I mean, a C compiler is not that complicated, right? That part of a C compiler is very simple. So it's not a huge onerous burden to do this. It's a couple days of work, but it's not some crazy onerous weird thing, if that makes sense. Guitar 87. Do you specifically have to say inline for functions to be inlined, or does the compiler do that automatically if it finds one or several to fit? It's both. So with inlining, it's generally a hint. So it doesn't really do anything. It's just telling the compiler, in case you weren't going to consider this for inlining, do consider this for inlining. But the compiler doesn't have to do it. And also a function that's not marked inline, the compiler doesn't have to leave that out of line. It can inline that as well. So the compiler is given pretty much complete latitude to inline whatever it wants, whenever it wants, and to the degree to which it takes your suggestions into account is entirely up to it. There's a directive in MSVC to force inlining, a directive not to force inlining, or to force non-inlining. I don't know if either of those are required, but I think they're almost always followed. So unlike inline, which could often not be followed if the compiler didn't want to, I think force inline's almost always followed if the compiler actually can. But there may be parts where the compiler just doesn't, it's like the compiler doesn't do that or whatever. And it doesn't want to do that for some very hard reason. Like it doesn't have code to do it properly or something like that, or it thinks it would recurse too many times, or it doesn't know how to, I don't know. So I think force inline is pretty reliable, and force non-inline is also pretty reliable in terms of, it'd be rare for them not to do it. Whereas the inline keyword, I don't get the sense that that's that strong. I think that's like, if the compiler agrees with you, it'll do it. If not, it won't. But I don't know. It tends not to be that big of a concern. Like, unless your code is super object-oriented nastiness where it's got all these, little tiny functions that don't do much just to get at things, then, most of the time, you're just inlining your operations, and, if either the compiler does or it doesn't, it's not a huge deal. The couple places where you've got real workhorse code happening, where you care a lot about what's happening, are things you tend to optimize a little bit by hand anyway, and you're not going to, you're not going to be worrying about that. You're going to look at that code. Did the compiler inline stuff or didn't it? If it didn't, you could manually inline it if you have to, or turn it into a macro. So, it's it's really not a huge deal. I wouldn't spend a lot of time really worrying about inlining. It's really not that big a deal. Would you try to fix the memory in place, or would you copy it to a new memory arena? You have to. It has to be new arena, and the reason for that is because the sizes can change, and they can change in a way that you can't fix. So, for example, if a struct got bigger, you can't necessarily change it in place because there's data that comes after it, and you're going to overwrite it, right? So when you're doing a remapping, it has to be to new memory typically. It's not super plausible to write a system that would use the same memory space. So during the remapping, you would make a new arena, and you would copy from one arena to the other. Programming style. Why do you have the function return on the preceding line? Oh, you're talking about this. This was a habit I got into that I just sort of like, which is I like having the name of the function be the first thing on the line. The way I originally started is amusing. Although I don't ever use them anymore, I used to use like templates a lot when I programmed. When I used to be much more C++y, kind of back in 1998, 99. And I found that template specifiers were so long that I ended up having to break my function definitions up into 2 lines anyway, like that. My function declarations, or definitions in this case. And so I just, even after I stopped using the templates, I still kind of liked it that way, so that's just how I do it. Strange Zach. Yeah, I don't know what the deal was. When I asked about inlining last night, it blew up everywhere. Yeah, I mean, I really just don't think about inlining hardly at all. I call functions inline more as a note to myself. I think I've said this before than anything else. If I put inline before something, it's like me sort of saying either I think this should never be something that actually gets called. It should probably be something that's just welded in because it's something that wants to be optimized away, right? You get a function like this, and I'm just like, I just want this to get inserted so you can optimize it away, and you can see so that the compiler will look at those terms in the context of optimizing the thing that they get inserted into. It's either that, or this is something I think only gets called once. So I just want to smush all these things together, right? Because they don't need to be broken up. But I really am not, I'm not sitting around agonizing over it, because if I'm doing performance optimization, then I need to start measuring things, and I can't. These days, there's no way to just know if it was smarter to inline something than not. I mean, it's just simply not plausible. And so I feel like, for the most part, I just don't care that much about whether the compiler will or won't inline it, because when it actually gets to be important further down the line, I'm going to have to start timing those things anyway to know whether I should have inlined it or not, if it was something that was really that, on the edge. Gary Johansson, I was messing around with loop unrolling by hand and got massive speedups. Any idea why that would be? Well, in order to know why that would be, I'd probably have to look at the code that you were unrolling, and then maybe I could give you some guesses. However, I would say, as you've seen me do on the show before, you can look at the assembly language that was generated, and you should be able to maybe make some guesses. Take a look at what it looks like with and without unrolling, and then figure out what was the big change there, right? I think that may be all the questions for today. I think that'll be it for today. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it down. There we go. Thank you everyone for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with all the source code so that you can play around with it in the comfort of your own computer. We also have a forum site if you want to ask questions about the series as you work through the programming, or if you have other programming questions. We have a Patreon page if you want to support the video series. You can subscribe to that. It is always very much appreciated. We also have a tweet bot that tweets the schedule at you. So if you want to know when the series is going to be live, you can hit that. And the answer to that, it will be live tomorrow, 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. So check that out if you would like to see some more programming. The other thing that I try to mention is the editor that we use was actually created by someone who watches the stream. It's called 4Coder. If you type 4Coder into Google, you'll get this page, and you can become a patron of his development progress, at which point you can pick from a number of different reward tiers. Previously, I had mentioned that if you do the $10 tier, you get the Handmade Hero config that we use here on the stream. Alan asked me to just give that away for free, and it's his money, so if that's what he would like, it will just come with Handmade Hero from now on. So what I can do is the 4Coder here that we were using, I guess it's 4Coder Casey, somewhere on here. Where is it? It's 4Coder Casey. That 4Coder Casey file, I'm just going to put it in the Handmade directory, and as of today, it'll just be in there. So anyone who has Handmade Hero can just use it. So I'll put that in the MISC directory, I guess, because it's not really part of our code. So it'll just go in there. So there it is, and I will try to keep that up to date as I make changes to it, so you can grab it from there. That's it for today. I hope to see you guys tomorrow. Until then, have fun programming, and I will see you all on the internet. Take it easy, everybody.